He didn't lose you all at once. He lost you in the quiet moments he thought didn't matter, until one day, the silence was louder than your voice ever was. You brought peace, not chaos, and that confused him in ways he didn't have language for at the time. Because most people don't grow up learning how to recognize peace. They grow up learning how to survive noise, raised voices, emotional unpredictability, love that feels conditional, attention that comes and goes. For many, that becomes the definition of connection. If it's loud, it must be real. If it hurts, it must matter. If it keeps you guessing, it must be love. And then you showed up. You didn't raise your voice to be heard. You didn't create drama to feel chosen. You didn't test him just to see if he would stay. You spoke calmly. You listened fully. You addressed problems without turning them into wars. You brought a steadiness that didn't shake the ground, but held it in place. That kind of presence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists. And for someone used to chaos, that can feel deeply unsettling. Because peace asks a quiet question, who are you when there's nothing to fight against? When you were with him, there were no emotional roller coasters, no guessing games, no constant fear of losing you based on mood or manipulation. You didn't disappear to make a point. You didn't withhold affection to gain control. You didn't confuse intensity with intimacy. You were consistent, and consistency can feel boring to someone who equates love with adrenaline. Studies in psychology talk about how people raised in emotionally unstable environments often associate calm with emptiness. Their nervous system has been trained to stay alert, to scan for danger, to expect something to go wrong. So when nothing does, they feel uncomfortable, not because something is missing, but because something unfamiliar is present. That unfamiliar thing was safety. You created a space where he didn't have to perform, where he didn't have to guess your reactions, where he could speak without being punished for honesty. You didn't weaponize his vulnerability. You didn't turn his mistakes into permanent labels. You addressed issues directly, then let them go instead of keeping score. And that confused him. Because chaos is loud, but it's predictable in its own twisted way. Peace is quiet, and it leaves room for self-reflection. When the noise stops, a person starts hearing their own thoughts, their doubts, their insecurities, their unresolved wounds. With you, there was no distraction. When things were calm, he had to sit with himself. And not everyone knows how to do that. You didn't push him to open up, but somehow he did. You didn't demand emotional depth, but it naturally emerged. Conversations went deeper than surface-level talk. Silence didn't feel awkward. Being together didn't require constant stimulation. You were comfortable just being. That kind of calm intimacy can feel disarming to someone who has learned to protect themselves through distance or chaos. It removes the armor. It exposes the parts they've been avoiding. And when someone isn't ready to face those parts, peace feels like pressure. Not pressure from you, but pressure from within. He may have misread your calm as lack of passion, your emotional control as lack of feeling, your maturity as emotional distance. But the truth was, you felt deeply. You just didn't let your emotions run the relationship. You didn't fight to win. You fought to understand. You didn't love to possess. You loved to connect. And that's rare. In real life, many relationships are fueled by emotional spikes, arguments followed by intense breakups followed by dramatic returns. Neuroscience shows that these cycles release dopamine and cortisol, creating a chemical bond that feels intense but unstable. Calm relationships don't provide that rush. Instead, they build oxytocin, trust, bonding, security, slower, quieter, stronger. You were building something lasting. He wasn't sure he wanted something that required that level of presence. Sometimes he may have pulled away for no clear reason. Not because you did something wrong, but because things felt too steady, too real, too safe. And safety, when you're not used to it, can feel like a trap instead of a gift. You probably noticed it in small moments. When you handled conflict calmly, and he seemed irritated instead of relieved. When you stayed composed and he interpreted it as indifference. When you offered understanding and he responded with distance, you weren't cold, you were grounded. You weren't detached. You were emotionally regulated. But to someone still addicted to chaos, regulation looks like emptiness. And yet, even as he struggled to understand it, part of him recognized it. He felt better around you. He slept better, thought clearer, reacted less. Life felt quieter in a way he couldn't explain. You became the calm in his storm, and storms don't always appreciate calm while they're raging. They only understand its value once it's gone. You didn't provoke jealousy to feel desired. You didn't test loyalty with mind games. You trusted until trust was broken. You spoke your needs instead of hinting at them. You didn't force connection, you allowed it. That level of emotional health can intimidate someone who is still learning how to manage their inner world, because your peace highlighted the places where he still felt restless. Your clarity made his confusion more obvious. Your stability reflected his inconsistency, and instead of rising to meet it, he may have resisted it. Not because you weren't enough, but because you were more than he knew how to handle. You gave him a version of love that didn't hurt. And for someone who learned that love always comes with pain, that can feel unreal, suspicious, temporary, so he questioned it. He may have mistaken your lack of drama for lack of excitement, your emotional safety for predictability, your steady affection for something he could always come back to later. People often assume peace will wait, but peace doesn't beg to be chosen. It doesn't chase. It doesn't compete with chaos. It simply exists until it's no longer valued. And when you finally stepped back, when your calm presence was no longer there to soften his edges, the silence felt different, not peaceful, empty. That's when confusion turns into realization, because chaos is loud when peace is gone, the noise returns, the emotional swings come back, the misunderstandings multiply, and suddenly the calm that once felt boring feels priceless. You were never passive. You were intentional. You weren't quiet because you lacked strength. You were quiet because you had control. You didn't need chaos to feel alive. You brought life through presence. And whether he understood it then or only later, the truth remains the same. You offered something rare in a world addicted to noise. You brought peace. And for someone who didn't know how to live without chaos, that was the most confusing and most valuable gift of all. You saw him clearly and still chose him. Not the version he tried to sell the world. Not the highlight reel. Not the confident mask he wore when he wanted to be admired. You saw the pauses in his voice, the hesitation behind his laughter, the way his eyes changed when he thought no one was paying attention. You noticed the cracks he worked so hard to hide. And you didn't turn away. That kind of seeing is rare. Most people look to confirm what they want to believe. You look to understand what was actually there. You noticed his strengths, yes, but you also noticed his fears. The ambition that pushed him forward and the doubt that pulled him back. You saw the discipline in some areas of his life and the avoidance in others. You saw where he showed up fully and where he disappeared when things got uncomfortable. You didn't romanticize his potential while ignoring his reality. You held both at the same time, and still you chose him, not because you needed to be needed, not because you thought you could save him, but because you believed that honesty was a better foundation than illusion. You believed that real connection begins when people are seen as they are, not as they pretend to be. In a world where most relationships are built on projection, you offered clarity. You didn't confuse charm with character. You watched how he treated people who couldn't offer him anything. You paid attention to how he handled disappointment, how he spoke when he was tired, how he reacted when things didn't go his way. You noticed the patterns, not just the promises. And yet, instead of using that knowledge as a reason to walk away, you used it as a reason to stay present. You understood that people are unfinished, that growth is uneven, that fear doesn't always mean lack of care. You gave him the dignity of being human. Psychology tells us that being deeply seen can be one of the most uncomfortable experiences a person can have. Not seen for performance, not admired from a distance, but truly seen, flaws, contradictions, and all. Because when someone sees you clearly, excuses don't survive. You can't hide behind potential forever. You're faced with who you are right now. With you, he couldn't pretend. You didn't flatter his ego. You didn't inflate his image. You reflected him back to himself with honesty and compassion. When he was wrong, you didn't attack, but you didn't lie either. When he was struggling, you didn't shame him, but you didn't enable him. That balance takes strength. You created a space where he could be real without being destroyed for it. You listened without rushing to fix. You asked questions instead of making assumptions. You allowed silence when words weren't ready. You didn't force vulnerability, but somehow it happened anyway. And that kind of presence changes people. Studies on emotional intimacy show that the strongest bonds are formed not through constant agreement, but through feeling understood. You gave him that understanding. You didn't demand perfection. You asked for effort. You didn't require him to have it all figured out. You expected him to be honest about what he didn't know. But being chosen while being fully seen can feel heavy to someone who hasn't chosen themselves yet. Because when someone accepts you without illusion, the responsibility shifts. You can no longer blame misunderstanding. You can no longer hide behind confusion. You are seen, and now you have to decide who you want to be. That's where the weight came in. You didn't love blindly. You loved consciously. You knew where the relationship would require patience. You knew where it would require boundaries. You knew what you could offer and what you couldn't fix. And still, you stayed. That wasn't weakness. That was courage. You believed that people grow better when they're seen, not shamed. That accountability can exist without cruelty. That love doesn't have to be earned through suffering. You didn't chase him when he pulled away. You didn't punish him when he struggled. You stayed grounded, present, available but not desperate. And that made your choice even more powerful. Because you weren't choosing him out of ignorance. You were choosing him with full awareness. You knew the risks. You understood the cost. And you decided that connection was worth the vulnerability. That kind of choice is rare in a world addicted to fantasy. Most people fall in love with who someone could be while ignoring who they are. You did the opposite. You accepted who he was while still believing growth was possible. You didn't confuse acceptance with complacency. You expected movement, not miracles. You saw his avoidance when things got hard. You saw how he sometimes shut down instead of speaking up. You noticed how he carried old wounds into new moments. You saw the way he deflected when accountability got close. And instead of using that as leverage, you used it as information. You adjusted how you spoke. You softened your approach without shrinking your truth. You chose timing. You chose patience. You chose empathy. But empathy doesn't mean self-erasure. There were moments when you hoped he would rise to meet the clarity you offered. Moments when you believed that being truly seen would inspire him to step forward more fully. And sometimes it did. Sometimes he surprised you. Sometimes he opened up in ways he never had before. Sometimes he tried, and those moments mattered. But seeing someone clearly also means seeing when they are not ready. And that realization hurts more than being misunderstood ever could. Because when someone doesn't choose growth despite being deeply seen, you can't tell yourself they didn't know better. They did. You showed them. Gently, honestly, consistently. You didn't love a mystery. You loved a person. And when the distance grew, when the effort became uneven, when the clarity you brought wasn't met with the same willingness to look inward, you felt the weight of that choice. Not regret, but grief. Grief for what was possible. Grief for what was offered and not fully received. Still, your choice remains powerful because you proved something to him and to yourself. You proved that love doesn't require blindness. That commitment doesn't require denial. That choosing someone doesn't mean abandoning discernment. You showed that it's possible to see someone completely and still treat them with respect. And whether he understood it in the moment or only later, the impact of being truly seen doesn't disappear. It lingers. It reshapes how someone experiences future connections. It becomes a reference point. Because once you've been seen without illusion, it's hard to go back to being loved only for a performance. You saw him clearly. And in doing so, you demonstrated a level of emotional maturity that doesn't fade with time. You didn't lose yourself in the act of choosing. You didn't sacrifice your awareness for the sake of attachment. You loved with your eyes open. And that kind of love, whether it lasts or not, changes everything. You didn't need him, you chose him. And that single truth carries more strength than most people ever realize. Because needing someone comes from lack. It comes from fear, from emptiness, from the belief that without another person, you wouldn't stand on your own. But choosing someone, that comes from wholeness, from stability, from knowing exactly who you are, what you bring, and what your life already holds, and still deciding to share it. You were already standing when he met you. You had your own rhythm, your own world, your own way of handling life. You knew how to be alone without feeling lonely. You knew how to sit with yourself in silence and not panic. You didn't require constant reassurance to feel valuable. You didn't need someone else's presence to validate your existence. And that's what made your love different. You didn't attach yourself to him out of desperation. You didn't cling. You didn't collapse your identity into the relationship. You didn't make him the center of your universe. Instead, you invited him into a life that was already moving, already meaningful, already full. That kind of love is rare and unsettling. Because many people are comfortable being needed. It gives them control. It gives them importance. It feeds the ego. When someone depends on you, you feel powerful. But when someone chooses you freely, without dependency, without fear, without obligation, that's different. That's no longer about power. That's about worth. And not everyone knows how to sit with that. You didn't stay because you were afraid of losing him. You stayed because you enjoyed his presence, because you respected parts of him, because you saw something real there. You weren't trapped. You weren't stuck. You weren't waiting for him to complete you. You were complete, and you shared yourself anyway. Psychology often talks about interdependence as the healthiest form of connection. Two people who can stand alone, choosing to walk together. You embodied that without turning it into a concept or a strategy. It was simply who you were. You didn't demand constant attention. You didn't crumble when plans changed. You didn't chase reassurance when silence appeared. You trusted yourself. And when you trust yourself, you don't need to trap anyone else. That can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who equates love with possession. Because if you don't need him, he can't control you with distance. He can't manipulate you with withdrawal. He can't anchor his value in your dependency. You loved him without handcuffs. And freedom is intimidating to people who are afraid of being chosen for who they really are. You didn't beg him to stay. You didn't threaten to leave to get a reaction. You didn't perform loyalty to prove your worth. You didn't negotiate your boundaries to keep him close. You didn't shrink yourself so he could feel bigger. You showed up as an equal. And equality removes excuses, because when someone knows you're not there out of need, every effort matters more. Every choice becomes clearer. Every inconsistency becomes visible. There's no illusion that you'll stay no matter what. You could leave, and both of you knew it. Not in a dramatic way, not as a warning, but as a quiet truth that lived in the background. You had options, you had resilience, you had the ability to rebuild your life if needed. And still, you chose him. That choice wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't theatrical. It was steady, consistent, intentional. You chose him in the small moments when things were calm, when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain. You chose him when it would have been easier to walk away. That's not weakness. That's strength under control. Many people stay because they're afraid to be alone. You stayed because you believed in connection. There's a difference. One is rooted in fear. The other is rooted in courage. You didn't need him to rescue you from your life. You invited him to share it. And that invitation carries responsibility. Because when someone knows you don't need them, they also know they can lose you. Not through games, not through manipulation, but through their own choices, their effort, their honesty, their consistency. That kind of clarity can feel heavy. It removes the comfort of being taken for granted. You didn't ask him to be perfect. You didn't expect him to always get it right, but you expected presence, growth, accountability. You expected him to choose you back, not out of habit, but out of intention. And that's where the tension often begins, because some people want love without responsibility. They want connection without effort. They want loyalty without consistency. They want the benefits of being chosen without having to earn that choice every day. You didn't offer that kind of love. You offered something cleaner, something stronger, something that didn't trap either of you. You didn't lose yourself in him. You didn't stop being curious about your own life. You didn't abandon your goals, your values, your sense of direction. You didn't make him the source of your happiness. You brought happiness with you. And when someone brings happiness instead of demanding it, it changes the dynamic completely. It means the relationship becomes a place of sharing, not survival. You didn't say, "I can't live without you." You said, without words, "I can live fully and I choose to share that with you." That distinction matters, because when love is a choice, it remains honest. There's no hidden resentment, no silent tally of sacrifices, no unspoken expectation that the other person owes you their life because you gave up yours. You didn't give up yourself. You gave your presence. And presence is the most valuable thing a person can offer when it's not required for survival. He may not have understood it at the time. He may have mistaken your independence for emotional distance. He may have assumed you'd always be there because you didn't cling. He may have underestimated how much effort it takes to keep someone who doesn't need you. But the truth doesn't change. You didn't stay because you were afraid to be alone. You stayed because you believed in the connection you were building. And when that belief was no longer supported by action, you didn't collapse. You stood. That's what makes your choice powerful, even if it ended, even if it changed, even if it hurt. You prove that love doesn't have to come from lack. That attachment doesn't have to come from fear. That commitment doesn't require self-abandonment. You showed what it looks like to love freely, and people don't forget that, because once someone experiences being chosen by a person who doesn't need them, it changes the standard forever. Dependency feels hollow after that. Control feels empty. Games feel childish. You didn't need him. You chose him. And that choice, rooted in strength, not fear, is something no outcome can take away from you. You loved deeply, but you respected yourself more. And that balance is something most people never learn how to hold. Because loving deeply is easy to romanticize. It looks beautiful from the outside. It sounds noble. It feels powerful in stories and movies. But in real life, deep love without self-respect turns into sacrifice without limits, patience without boundaries, and loyalty without protection. You didn't fall into that trap. You loved with your whole heart, but you didn't hand it over without conditions. You showed affection freely. You listened with intention. You cared about his worries, his dreams, his fears. When he spoke, you were present. When he struggled, you didn't disappear. You gave reassurance without being asked. You gave understanding without keeping score. You gave love in a way that was warm, human, and sincere. But you never forgot yourself in the process. You didn't shrink to keep the peace. You didn't stay silent when something mattered. You didn't accept behavior that chipped away at your dignity just to avoid conflict. You didn't confuse tolerance with love. You knew the difference between patience and self-betrayal. That takes strength. Many people think self-respect means being cold, distant, or guarded. But you proved something different. You showed that you can be soft and still have a spine, that you can be kind and still say no, that you can love someone deeply without allowing them to step over you. You spoke your truth calmly, not with accusations, not with drama, but with clarity. When something hurt you, you named it. When a boundary was crossed, you addressed it. You didn't weaponize your emotions, but you didn't hide them either. You trusted your feelings enough to honor them. Psychology shows that people who maintain healthy self-respect in relationships are more emotionally stable and resilient. They're less likely to lose themselves, less likely to develop resentment, and more likely to walk away when values are consistently violated. You lived that truth without needing a theory to back it up. You felt deeply, but you observed honestly. You noticed when effort changed, when words stopped matching actions, when apologies repeated without improvement. You didn't ignore patterns just because you cared. You didn't rewrite reality to protect the relationship. You paid attention, and paying attention is an act of self-respect. You didn't threaten to leave to gain control. You didn't test him with silence. You didn't create distance to provoke chasing. You simply adjusted your presence when your boundaries weren't honored. That kind of response is powerful because it's quiet. Instead of escalating, you withdrew your energy. Instead of arguing endlessly, you observed. Instead of begging for change, you allowed space for truth to reveal itself. You understood something many people don't. People show you who they are most clearly when you stop explaining yourself. You didn't stop loving him overnight. Love doesn't work like that. You still felt it, still cared, still hoped. But you refused to let love become the reason you abandoned yourself. That's the line you never crossed. You didn't excuse disrespect because of potential. You didn't justify emotional neglect because of history. You didn't accept inconsistency just because there were good moments. You knew that love isn't proven in promises, but in patterns. And when the pattern didn't align with the love you were offering, you didn't panic. You paused, you gave space for accountability, you gave room for growth. But you didn't wait forever. You didn't keep explaining what should already be understood. You didn't turn yourself into a lesson someone refused to learn. That's self-respect. You understood that love doesn't mean enduring everything. It means choosing what aligns with your values. It means knowing when compassion turns into self-neglect. It means recognizing that your heart is not an unlimited resource meant to be drained. You protected your energy. And protecting your energy doesn't mean you loved less. It means you loved wisely. You were willing to have hard conversations, the kind that risked discomfort instead of hiding behind silence. You were willing to disappoint him rather than disappoint yourself. You were willing to be misunderstood rather than be disrespected. That's not coldness. That's courage. You didn't demand perfection. You didn't expect constant happiness. You understood that relationships involve effort, mistakes, and growth. But you also understood that love without mutual respect eventually turns into pain. You didn't romanticize struggle. You knew that real love doesn't require you to suffer endlessly to prove its depth. It doesn't ask you to accept less than you give. It doesn't ask you to tolerate being diminished. You didn't love recklessly. You loved with awareness. And that awareness changed everything. When he crossed a line, you didn't explode. You didn't beg. You didn't plead for him to see your worth. You trusted that your worth didn't need convincing. You let your actions speak louder than emotional reactions. You stepped back. That moment when love meets self-respect is one of the most powerful moments a person can experience. Because it's the moment you choose yourself without becoming bitter. The moment you honor your heart without betraying your values. You didn't harden. You didn't close off. You simply stopped giving unlimited access to someone who wasn't handling it with care. That decision wasn't made in anger. It was made in clarity, and clarity doesn't scream. It settles. You accepted that loving deeply doesn't guarantee being loved correctly. You accepted that your capacity to love doesn't obligate someone else to rise to it. You accepted that walking away can sometimes be the most loving thing you do for both of you. That acceptance is maturity. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you cared enough about yourself to not stay where love required self-erasure. You understood that staying in situations that diminish you slowly teaches others how to treat you, so you chose differently. And even if it hurt, Even if it took time to heal, you never lost your sense of self. You never questioned your worth. You never wondered if you were too much. You knew you were simply asking for what matched the love you gave. You loved deeply, but you respected yourself more. And that truth will carry you forward into every connection that comes after. Because once you learn how to hold both love and self-respect in the same hands, you never forget how it feels. You never go back to love that costs you your dignity. You never settle for affection that requires silence. You carry your heart with strength now, not guarded, not closed, just rooted. And that kind of love, the kind that honors both connection and self-worth, doesn't fade. It evolves, it deepens. And when it's met with the right person, it finally feels like home. He realized too late that you were irreplaceable, not in a dramatic moment, not with a speech or a confession that arrived on time. It came quietly, in the spaces you used to fill without effort, in the silence where your voice used to steady things, in the calm that disappeared when you walked away. That's usually how it happens. Understanding doesn't arrive when it could change the outcome. It arrives when the outcome is already set. At first, he didn't notice what was happening. Life kept moving, days passed. Distractions did their job. He told himself the same stories people always tell themselves when something valuable leaves, that it wasn't that serious, that it could be replaced, that time would smooth it out. He thought he missed the relationship. He thought he missed the routine. What he didn't understand yet was that he was missing you, the way you showed up, the way you anchored moments without trying to control them. You were never loud about what you gave. You didn't announce your value. You didn't keep a list of sacrifices. You didn't remind him every time you did something kind that you were doing it. You just did it. Consistently, quietly, fully. And because it was steady, it became invisible. That's the danger of being rare and calm in a world addicted to noise. People mistake what's constant for what's guaranteed. He assumed your presence was part of the background, like air. Necessary, but unnoticed until it's gone. He didn't think about how much you softened his days, how conversations felt easier around you, how problems seemed smaller when you were there, how he felt more himself without having to prove anything. You didn't demand space in his life, you made space. And when you stopped, that's when reality started to speak. It spoke in small ways first. Moments when he reached for his phone out of habit, then remembered there was no one to send that thought to anymore. Times when something happened, good or bad, and his first instinct was to tell you, only to realize you weren't there to receive it. That reflex doesn't disappear easily. It's built through trust, through shared presence, through being understood without explanation. That's when the weight started to settle in. He tried to fill the gap the way people usually do. New faces, new conversations, temporary distractions. But replacement only works for things that are interchangeable. And you weren't. He discovered that not everyone listens the way you listened. Not everyone understands without turning it into an argument. Not everyone brings peace instead of pressure. Not everyone knows when to speak and when to simply sit in silence without making it uncomfortable. What he lost wasn't just love, it was a standard. You didn't just care, you noticed. You noticed when something was off before it became a problem. You noticed his moods before he spoke. You noticed patterns he pretended weren't there, and you addressed them without cruelty, without humiliation, without ego. That kind of awareness doesn't show up often. And when it does, it doesn't repeat itself easily. He started to realize that other connections felt louder but emptier. More exciting at first, but less grounding over time. Conversations circled the surface. Conflicts escalated instead of resolving. Affection came with conditions. Attention came with expectations. With you, it had been different. You didn't love to control. You loved to understand. You didn't attach to possess. You connected to grow. You didn't stay to be needed. You stayed because you chose to be there, and that choice carried weight he didn't understand until it was no longer being offered. There's a particular kind of regret that comes when you realize you were treated with patience you didn't earn, when someone gave you space to grow and you mistook it for weakness, when someone saw your flaws clearly and didn't use them against you, and you took that grace for granted. That regret doesn't shout, it sits quietly. It follows you into future conversations. It shows up when you realize you're explaining things you never had to explain before, when you're defending boundaries you never had to defend, when you're searching for depth where there is only availability. He realized that you were irreplaceable not because you were perfect, but because you were real. You didn't perform love. You practiced it. You didn't create dependency. You built trust. You didn't demand change. You inspired it by example. And now every comparison leads back to you. Not because you were the only one who could love him, but because you loved him in a way that was rare, grounded, and honest. You didn't inflate his ego. You reflected his truth. You didn't compete with chaos. You offered peace. Peace is easy to underestimate when you've never lived without it. He began to understand that what he lost wasn't dramatic passion that burns out quickly. It was something slower, deeper, something that would have lasted if it had been protected instead of assumed. You were the kind of person whose value becomes clear in absence, the kind whose impact is felt long after the door closes, the kind whose influence doesn't fade, it sharpens with time. He may replay moments now, conversations he didn't take seriously, apologies he delayed, efforts he postponed, chances he assumed would always be there. He may recognize the exact points where he could have chosen differently, spoken sooner, shown up better. But time doesn't rewind for realizations. And that's the hardest part, because understanding without access is a different kind of pain. It's the awareness that the lesson arrived, but the opportunity has passed. That growth happened, but too late to save what mattered. You didn't leave impulsively. You didn't walk away to prove a point. You stayed until staying meant losing yourself. You gave chances without announcing them. You waited without threatening. And when you finally stepped back, it wasn't to punish him, it was to protect yourself. That's why the loss cut deep. Because it wasn't loud, it was final. And now, in quieter moments, he understands what can't be recreated. The way you balanced strength with softness. The way you held boundaries without shutting down. The way you loved deeply without losing yourself. The way you made connection feel safe instead of consuming. Those qualities don't come in abundance. You didn't just fit into his life. You elevated it. And whether he admits it out loud or keeps it to himself, the realization lives there now. In every comparison that falls short. In every moment of calm that feels incomplete. In every relationship that lacks the depth he once experienced without recognizing its worth. You were irreplaceable not because no one else exists, but because no one else was you. And the truth is, the realization didn't come to elevate you. You already knew your value. It came to teach him something he'll carry forward forever. Some people enter our lives to stay. Some enter to teach, and some leave only to become the lesson that never stops echoing. He realized too late, but you walked away right on time. And this is where the story settles, not in regret, not in anger, but in truth. You were never meant to beg to be understood or wait to be valued. You showed up fully, loved honestly, and walked away with your dignity intact. What was lost was not your worth, but his chance to rise to it. Some lessons arrive late, but they are still lessons. And while he carries the weight of realizing too late, you carry something far more powerful. You carry clarity, strength, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows they were never replaceable.